When I started Sendgrid, I was focused a lot on the mission. Because of that, I started trying to look for a COO. After some time, we couldn't find one. And it was me, the person that was responsible for that. I don't think I was the CEO with great personality that would motivate someone to join. And so I tried to interview people for the CEO role, and no one joined. And after some time, we changed the title from COO to CEO, and we got great candidates.
My guest today is Isaac Saldana, co-founder and former CEO of Sendgrid, the API-centric email platform, which went public in 2017 and was acquired by Twilio for $3 billion in 2019. Before Sendgrid, Isaac started multiple startups that failed and faced a ton of challenges as a first-time founder with very little business background and a very shy personality. Today, we discussed Isaac's challenges in transitioning from founder to a CEO, his decision to bring an external CEO to Sendgrid, and the lessons he learned along the way. We also covered the company building lessons he gained at Sendgrid, including insights on product development, market timing, and team building. Finally, we talked about his latest venture, Memo, and how he aims to empower introverts to build their personal brands and social capital in a world dominated by social media. Isaac is a very successful yet low-profile and humble founder, so I'm sure many of you will empathize with his personal story. I hope that you enjoy my conversation with Isaac Saldana of Sendgrid and Memo. Hi, Isaac. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you. Isaac, I want to start talking about your own personal growth story as the founder and CEO of Sendgrid, and then obviously other companies you've worked on and Memo currently. And something interesting that I found while researching you was that ever since the start of Sendgrid, you knew that you weren't the right people to run the business long term. And this sounds extremely self-aware as a founder. Where did this clarity of mind came from?
When I started Sendgrid, I was focused a lot on the mission and kind of what we wanted to do. And I was well aware that I was a software engineer and that I was going to need help. And because of that, I started trying to look for a COO for the longest time. And after some time, we couldn't find one. And it was me, the person that was responsible for that. I don't think I was the CEO with great personality that would motivate someone to join as essentially second in command for the experience that I needed. And so I tried to interview people for the CEO role, and no one joined. And after some time, we changed the title from COO to CEO, and we got great candidates. Now, in this process, when I was CEO, we raised 2 rounds. We raised our seed round, $750K. And then 6 months later, we raised our second round, our Series A, for $5 million. Now, what many people don't know is that when we had the offer for that round, we also had an acquisition offer. And so an offer that would have made the founders millionaires. 6 months in, after being so broke, it was very attractive. But it was then, with the help of the board, that I understood that Sendgrid was already bigger than the founders, and it was about that mission. And so that event was one of the many that helped me realize that this was about what we wanted to do and not necessarily about me in particular or anyone else.
Tell me a bit about the thoughts that were going through your mind, as you felt like you were holding back the company, because it's not a tough decision to take so early in the journey of a company. I think it's more common that you see founders eventually hiring CEOs, usually in a growth stage or when they're about to go public. You did it pretty early on in the life of Sendgrid. So I'm curious did you felt like you were holding back the company? How was that process more on a personal level?
So yes, I knew I was going to hold back the company, but it was early on. Like even our first investors, I said, you know what, I want to be the CEO, but I need a COO because I didn't know many things. And to the point where it's like when we raised our first round, I had to ask the investors, what kind of bank account do I open? Is it a business account? What bank do I go to? So there were just many things that I didn't know. And so it was obvious to me And I was very transparent with the board. And so I got so lucky that there were board members, investors, but also mentors. And so they helped me navigate through this. And I was self-aware. And I had two options. One is I want to learn all of these things and probably get a mentor, a CEO mentor that has done this and could help. But instead, what I chose to do was to focus on the product. And so I just paid so much attention to the product, and that's what I wanted to do. And because I wanted to do that, I knew that the CEO role was going to be lacking, especially the operations side of things.
And I think that requires an incredible amount of self-awareness and low ego to take as a decision.
The way I see it is that I think I just had a little bit of less pressure, especially coming from a background where you just don't have money, and now someone giving you $1 million. It's like, whoa, and that's a lot of responsibility for not knowing and figuring things on the fly. And so I felt that too. And so I just felt good having someone that would manage. In fact, when we raised the first $750K, then the $5 million, when we brought a CEO, so this was in 2011, we brought in a CEO. In 2010, we raised our Series A, and in 2009, we raised our seed round. We had all that money when the CEO came in. And so I was terrible at spending money because I felt so uncomfortable. And so I was also preventing the company from growing because you have all this money, you raise this money, you got to use it. And I didn't know how. In fact, spending that money on ads, marketing, or things like that just felt very uncomfortable to me.
It sounds like, at least at the beginning, you did try to, and I've heard you talk about like this challenging evolution from going from a developer who didn't talk to anyone, and in your words, to becoming a CEO. What were the hardest things about that transition? And also I think something very interesting that you said is that you decided to focus on products, which were your strengths, right? There's also this dichotomy on, okay, I want to go from a great developer, a great product person to become a CEO, but it usually involves reducing the attention and time you put on your actual strengths, right? They're more natural, the places where you naturally gravitate towards. So I wonder, how do you think about that balance?
I think I got very lucky on this transition because I think it's important to talk about how the process of bringing a CEO and what my requirements were. To bring a CEO, I worked with about 4 people for about 6 months. And I feel so lucky that these awesome people were willing to give me their time for about 6 months just to see if we were a fit, if Sendgrid was a fit for them, and if they were a fit for Sendgrid. And
you mean 4 potential candidates to CEO?
For 6 months. And so I got help from them. Sometimes I would bring them to meetings and stuff like that. So they would become familiar and give me advice. And so that made it very easy for me just to pick someone after 6 months. It's, yes, I want this person. That person, his name is Jim Franklin. He came in and he just did amazing things. But one requirement, in addition to just being great at executing, was to be a mentor to me because I did want to learn. And he was very good at running the company and also including me and decisions and things to learn. And I had the time to read. At some point in time, I read about 40 books in a year because I was hungry for learning. And now all that learning, I use it even on a day-to-day basis. In fact, I went ahead and after the Sendgrid IPO, I also got an MBA just to even double down on the education because I learned from the practical side of things in a business, but also from the academic side of things. And I feel way more comfortable now being a CEO.
In this learning process, was there a specific strategy or thing that you think moved the needle the most in your transition to becoming a CEO?
I think that what made the biggest difference for me is just understanding how to manage people. And that's just very tough because it includes a lot of communication, a lot of process. And what's crazy is that process has this negative connotation associated with being slow. And it's not necessarily true. In fact, right now at Memo, we have a process to be as efficient as possible. But to have this process, you need to have great communication. And that's very tough to know, because there are two sides of communication: the rational side, why things make sense, but also the emotional side. And understanding that essentially helped me quite a bit. One thing that I would recommend people to check out, we took something called Decker training, DECKER training. And that helped me quite a bit. And the way I communicated, not just in the company, but externally too, and presentations and stuff like that. And for the ones that are struggling, especially people that maybe English is not their primary language, and in my case, it's not. Spanish is. It helped me quite a bit. I still stutter quite a bit and stuff like that. But when it comes down to doing a presentation, and if I use my Decker training skills, then I can probably do an okay job.
That's amazing. Eventually, as you were saying, you brought in a CEO, and you were talking about these 4 candidates that you had the chance to work with hand to hand during 6 months. And this is obviously not an easy process. Can you walk us through that process in itself? What things were you looking for in these candidates? And I guess, how do you ultimately take the decision to pick, I think it's Jim, you mentioned?
Let me provide some timeline so that you see like the different events. So in 2009, we launched. August through November, we were racing. In November, we closed our first round. I was CEO then. We got this investment offer. We were not racing, but Foundry came to us and said, hey, we want to be part of this. Do you want to take $5 million? And at the same time, another company got interested in acquiring us. We went through that process. And so in 2009 and 2010, this is a year and 3 months of me looking for a COO. Then around February, March, there was a competitor that launched, and it was a competitor that probably everyone's aware of, and their name is Amazon. They released a product called Amazon SES. And so at that point, it was like, ooh, I think we just need to grow. We haven't spent this much money. How about we switch the role from being
COO to CEO?
Yeah, actually, let me correct that. I think at the end of 2010, we had discussed the option of switching the role of COO to CEO. And that's when we started getting together with candidates and working with them. By the time Amazon launched, we had already talked to multiple people for a few months. Soon after, that's when we made the decision to bring this person on board. Now, in 2010, that was when, I don't know if the book Delivering Happiness by Tony Hsieh was released, or I found out about Zappos. And so one of the companies that was very interesting to me was Zappos and Rackspace. Rackspace, I don't know I think they're still around, but like Rackspace was one of the leaders in hosting and managed hosting back then. And so I wanted to model some of the culture after them. So like very support driven culture. And so we came up with our values. And one of the things that made Jim Franklin very special is that in addition to, I think he has a legal background and a MBA and previous startup experience and stuff like that. But like one of the things that made Jim pretty special is he said, okay, I have 4 values that I'm looking for when joining something. And it was the 4 H's: humble, happy, honest, hungry. And he saw that the values that we had developed were compatible with his values. And obviously, because the 4 H's were much easier to remember, we adopted those once Jim Franklin joined. And that was a very big learning experience from me. That the first thing that I did when I started Memo, I created the values. And so Memo's values are HAPY. They spell out happy, and that's humility, adaptability, peers, passion, and you. And in summary, that's essentially what made Jim Franklin special, because most people that we were talking to had the experience that we were looking for.
That's super, super interesting. And I love the fact that you were looking for that fit in between the culture of the CEO and your own company.
And what was special is that he was also looking for the same thing. So he was like, I want to align with the values. And up to now, values are very important to me. It's a great learning experience. And so one thing that I would recommend to all founders is not to leave those values after you find product market fit, try to essentially have those guide you since day one.
Now, I've met multiple founders going through this sort of transition process where some of their investors might propose, or even themselves, hey, I should probably bring a CEO or a president to a company who might eventually become a CEO. And this process usually takes a lot of time, like from the idea to actually happening, because it's a very personal process for the founder to do that, as we were speaking earlier. So I'm curious, what's your advice for founders that might find themselves in this process about how to take the decision, how to think through it? Because yeah, in the end, it's your baby, right? So it's the company's your baby. It's what you started. And most people, when you think about the story of successful founders or startups, there's usually this expectation that it's the founder who's going to become into CEO and run the company until it's acquired or goes for an IPO.
Yeah. I think I would start with the end, and I think the end looks like you hire your boss. And so you have to look at this person as your boss. Even I know you created it, it was your idea, and you have probably many other ideas, but ultimately he needs to have the ability to make decisions that are required for a CEO to make. And so they're essentially your boss. And so if you look at it that way, then everything just becomes much easier, because now you're like, okay, I'm going to support my boss. My boss needs this. To make my boss successful, I need to do this. And so obviously it's not just this one-way communication where you just have to support your boss. The boss actually, it's supposed to encourage that and enable that. And so I think for me, when we brought Jim on board and later Samir, I saw them as my boss. And so it was essentially, I had my time to provide my feedback, because it's not a command and control, or at least the CEOs, they're not running like a command and control organization. And so I always had my time to provide feedback, but ultimately I saw them no different than if I was working for another company and I was talking to the CEO. And so once you actually accept that, everything's just much easier, because now you don't have this thinking that it's your way or the highway. Now, a smart CEO would always ask the founder's opinion on things, specifically with gut feeling things, because I do believe that founders have the best gut feeling for any company, by far. Like not just a little, but by far. And so if CEOs take advantage of that, then you can have this great relationship where the founder feels included in the decisions. Ultimately, they may not be his or her decisions, but it could be a very good dynamic between the CEO and the founder.
That's fascinating. Probably what's more challenging is accepting it.
Yeah, that's why I actually wanted to start with the end. Is once you actually see this person as a boss, everything's just much easier. But yeah, you're exactly right. That's the challenge, is how do you get to that, because you created this. But I think one thing to remember is that it would make sense for the founder to be on the board. So if they need to make a change, to have a board that can make changes, and they're one-way decisions, but not completely. And so I think there is still a way to repair a bad decision. Obviously, it would be a very costly decision if you hire the wrong CEO, but man, I just got so lucky that I got to work with them for 6 months.
Yeah. Double clicking on this idea that you said before, that founders have the best gut feeling and CEOs should leverage that. Once this happens, what do you think should be the role of the founder that's taking a step back or becoming a CPO or COO or CTO? How can the company take advantage the most of still having the founder around, which in a sense goes to what was your role after this happened, right?
I can tell you related to that, like the mistakes that I did and that I wish I could do better. But in my case, I came up with the idea. I even came up with the initial prototype. And so I really understood our customers because I was one of them. And the CEO, the first CEO that we hired was not a developer. And I felt that he used me in trying to figure out how developers thought at that point. And then at some point, they do it on a daily basis. And so they can start getting their own gut feeling. But at this time, the founder is also thinking about, okay, what's coming next? And so they're working on the future, talking to customers and potentially introducing new ideas or products. And so the experience I have is just more on the product side of things. And so I think the founder should become the chief product officer, if it was in my case. I think one mistake that I did is that I failed to even suggest that. And so I became the president of the company. And so we ran without a product organization or a product leader. And I wish I would have
But in essence, you had that role.
No, I did not have that. It wasn't clear. We had product managers, but the product managers reported to different people in the organization. And at some point, we did have a VP of product, but the VP of product was not an executive. And so it was this weird thing that I wish we had, that I had to become like an initial chief product officer. And now I probably couldn't have, because I didn't know what a chief product officer did. But now I could have had the support of the CEO to say, okay, go and take this training and become that. Because I think I could have made it clear on how to prioritize the product. And mainly we were prioritizing based on things that we heard from customers. But obviously customers are not going to tell you everything, or they may just give you the problem, but not necessarily the solution. And so this is where the founders, I think, can have the good intuition of kind of what the solution should be. And I just wish I would have done a little bit more of that at Sendgrid.
Trying to get more specific into that, how did your role look like, and what are specific things that you think would have been much more, or added much more value if you had done?
Yeah, so I became essentially president, and so that meant I could go in different roles. We set up an R&D department so that I could work with these R&Ds initially to work on developer products, initially email products. And at some point, the company it was a benchmarking product called Loader.io, and yet we still had this email product that had also multiple products within it, like transactional email sending, marketing email sending. And so at some point, it didn't get clear as to whether we were a developers company or an email company. And so I just wish I would have provided more direction in that, where it's like, hey, this is the strategy that I recommend. And yeah, like I wish I would have just suggested to become more of the product leader rather than just this R&D leader that will just experiment with completely new products. The email side of things to focus on new products. And I wish I would have, obviously, I don't know what would have happened if I would have done this, but knowing what I know now, I wish I would have just provided more direction on the email side of things too.
That totally makes sense. And let's get deeper into the business of Sendgrid, the product of Sendgrid, because I'm sure that there's some lessons that we can derive from that story. But before getting specifically into Sendgrid, you founded two companies before Sendgrid, which from what I understand didn't do that well. So I'm curious, what lessons did you take from those experiences that were then key to how you built Sendgrid?
I remember my friend Elmer Thomas recommending me a book my last year of college called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And so I read that book so fast. And after finishing that book in a few days, I wanted to create companies. And I started creating companies with Elmer Thomas. And the first one that we created, this is back in 2003, it was essentially, we wanted to do what WordPress did. WordPress was not around, or at least it wasn't popular at that time. And we noticed that at that point, people that were developing websites would charge about $1,000 for a static page. And so most pages needed at least 5 pages. And so average cost of a website was about $5,000. We're like, we could actually have software that can generate these websites and charge a monthly fee. And so we did that. And at some point, we just ran out of money. We couldn't make it work because $20 per month at a time, it was just too little growth to support us. So we had to close it. And so what we learned from that is that you need funding, or funding would have been so helpful to continue that mission. Then on the second one, It was essentially what Thumbtack is, where you would try to look for a service provider who would bid for your request, and at some point you would pick the best one. So we got funding for that company. And by the way, the first thing that we wanted to do for the first company is have a great team. And so I think we had a pretty solid team. The second company, we had a solid team and funding, and it still didn't work. And so one of the things that I realized after that was that many times you just don't know what you don't know. And to solve for that problem, that's when you need mentors. And so you need a team, funding, a good idea, but also you need mentors that kind of tell you if just to even talk about problems that may or may not have a solution. And so that's when we found out about Techstars. And so Techstars is a mentorship-driven program. And we got in with the idea of Sendgrid, and we had 3 technical founders. So one of the things that we got from that program is more mentorship on the non-technical side of things. So in fact, our initial name for Sendgrid was smtpapi.com.
I heard it.
For me, it still makes a lot of sense, but
Most dirty name.
yeah, but people at Techstars are like, I can't even pronounce it. So you got to change it. And being a geek, I wrote a program and I put a few different words and tried all the permutations of send, email, mail, grid, cloud, etc. And the only domain that came back as available was Sendgrid. And so we're like, okay, this is a kind of, so there was no science on the name. It was just the domain that was available. But what we found is that I think if you embrace that you're not going to know everything, and that you're going to have, you're going to run into issues where they're very hard to know before. There are 2 things now that I would recommend founders to do is have mentors and also have values, because sometimes your mentors can't tell you the right answer, and your values are essentially that default mechanism that guides you in making decisions. And so that's why it's very important not just to have mentors, but also to have these values in case your mentors can't provide guidance.
And a lot of times they might actually provide guidance that goes against your values.
Exactly. You're exactly right. And so sometimes you get conflicting advice also from your mentors. And so that's why you need that. Your values remind you of all the time that you put into thinking about them, and say, yeah, I thought about these values for a reason. This is who I want this company to be, or what this company should be. And I'm going to make decisions based on that.
Did you ever make a decision that went against those values in Sendgrid's journey?
I think so. And I think that this has to do with how clear your values were. And actually, there's a reason why I didn't pick the 4 H's for memo. And that's also based on learning experience. I found that happiness, if you look at the definition of happiness, is when someone experiences positive thoughts. And obviously that's very subjective. It's like everyone considers happiness differently, because whatever makes you happy may not make me happy, or vice versa. And so that was one thing where it wasn't too clear. Some people interpret it like happiness as being able to have beers with your coworkers after work type of stuff, right? Where it may not even be what you were thinking about. It's happiness. I decided to actually spell it out on the values in memo. So HAPY, and define what we mean by those. And then honesty was another value. Now, honesty can get challenged many times when you have a legal employee matter that you can't talk about because it's illegal to talk about. And so then, are you being honest? Probably, but it's like you may not be able to say something because it's illegal, especially if you're a public company. That honesty value, essentially, honesty and transparency, they go hand in hand. And so this is where things can conflict. And so, yeah, I'm sure we made many decisions because maybe potentially our values were not clear. Now, the reason why I didn't adopt honesty on memo, it's because I see it more as a principle. So if you're not honest, we don't value honesty. Okay. You should have honesty. Yep. It's like you shouldn't lie.
It's a given.
Yeah. And so that's why I'm like, that's when I made the distinction of principles versus values.
I would love to talk about the business lessons from Sendgrid's success. Today, building an email API sounds like a solution that many companies would be able to offer. Like, it doesn't sound as a technical challenge as I'm sure it was then. So why do you think Sendgrid was so successful? Was it market timing, the technology you built, sales execution, or what specifically?
Yeah, I think there's a combination of timing. So timing, I think it's always probably the most important thing. So timing and also luck slash being very familiar with that market. For example, I worked around the hosting industry for most of my life as a hobby, not necessarily as professionally. And so I knew about how to set up servers, install software like control panel that would essentially resell parts of the server so that you can make some money. And so one of the things that we did is that when we wanted to develop the strategy, the go-to-market strategy for Sendgrid, it was about integrating with these hosting providers because we knew that these servers would generate spam and the admins of these servers had to deal with that. And so we're going to develop what we call the reseller API so that we can integrate with these control panels so that we could resell to these customers. Now, we never did that, but we developed the API. And the reason why we never did that is because around that time, when we were about to integrate with these control panels, there was a company called Heroku. They introduced this concept of platform as a service where you would just enable the things that you should use and magically they worked. And so one of the things that I did is someone posted on Twitter, hey, I'm having some type of problems with Heroku and spam. I quoted that tweet and went to their website. I didn't know anyone there, used the contact us form. And I said, hey, we solved this problem that one of your customers is having. And magically they replied and said, we're working on this thing called platform as a service. We'll develop the plugin for you. Just give us the API. And they just started growing like crazy. And so we took advantage of that growth. And then now other companies start integrating with us like Rackspace and at some point Microsoft and Google and stuff like that. And so there is some element of luck because we're like, hey, we have a go-to-market strategy that it's around control panels. We just abandoned that strategy because we found a better one, but that utilized probably 70% of what that initial go-to-market strategy is.
So in this case, what you mean is identifying this go-to-market through these other platforms enabled you to grow much faster and get to much more developers in a faster way.
Yeah. And so I think the business model makes a lot of sense. Let's keep going with this example of like companies being able to offer a service like Sendgrid. One thing that I could do just as a strategy if I wanted to compete in that market is just say, I'm going to offer this with a different business model. So it's instead of doing it, I think most business models around the email, it's like you get X number of credits, and then based on how many messages you sent, then they charge you based on that. I would say unlimited. And so that was like, oh, okay, that becomes interesting. And you would have to think about
economics.
Yeah. But business model makes a lot of sense. It's not just tech. Timing obviously would make sense. And in this case, because right now, the economy is weird. There's not much funding. I think startups are thinking about how to save money. And so that would be one, right? I think this strategy would last only for 2 years. So we have to execute now. And 3 years from now, we may have a different strategy. We might introduce new products, etc. And so this is one of the things that we got right at Sendgrid, but ultimately timing was probably the biggest factor.
What's something relatively minor that you changed in the way the product was built or the company operates that you think led to tremendous impact in your ability to execute and create product?
It dramatically affected the way we built product in a negative way, not in a positive way. And that was when essentially I stopped developing, and at some point our CTO became more of a manager instead of like developers. And I actually talked to different people, and many companies as they grow, they get slower. And we experience the same thing. I do a lot of research around that, and I still talk to founders of bigger companies that are experiencing that. What I know now I understand the problem more. I don't necessarily have the solution, and we're experimenting with some solution with different companies, either that I'm a board of or friends of. And so this is what happens. Around September, the CEO gets the executive team together, and he or she asks the executive team that they got to develop a budget for the following year. And so now the way it starts is that the chief product officer says, oh yeah, our customers are telling us that they need this. And they prioritize the things, and then they go to engineering, and engineering says, hey, how long is it going to take you to build these things? Hold on, let me go to my directors. The directors go to the managers. The managers go to the developers. Now the developers are like, ooh, I don't know. I think is this. They do a research for a few days. They come back to the manager with some leg room to get it, like some padding on the timing. The manager adds some padding to the director, adds some padding to the VP, and the VP adds some padding to the CEO, and the CEO adds some padding to the board. And so that's how most companies function. And then they commit to something, so they execute on that, and they find that at the end they're late. And so what the problem with that, and so the reason why that happens, is that the engineers didn't know what they were estimating. And so we're just guessing. And the problem, though, is that when they provide these estimates, they don't have a good idea on how good that estimate is. So confidence level on this. And so these confidence levels are like all over the place. And so what the product manager ends up doing is cutting features so that they can deliver something. And that's something that's never what everyone planned. Now, the way I think that it should be changed is that instead of doing that, CEOs, what they need to do is have some teams always prototyping so they can increase the confidence level on these predictions on how long it's going to take. Now the CEO can say, oh, let's just take from the 80% confidence level backlog, and we'll just prioritize features there because we're more confident that's what we're going to do. And so by that time, people have already worked on those features and have a good idea. So put the people that worked on those prototypes to actually develop the product because they're the most knowledgeable. And so things would be more predictable that way. Essentially, I actually did things to build slower, or that it was negatively impacting the company. Now we're trying to research things that are going to turn that around. And this is my hypothesis at this point. Don't have any data yet, but hopefully soon.
So you're talking basically about how rotten the resource allocation process of developers is.
Yeah.
And what you mentioned at the end sounds a lot like this 80-20 rule of Google, where you can spend 20% of your time on random projects, prototypes, which if then have some fit to it, some foundations to it, then you can come and pitch it to the C-level and actually invest in them, but with some data on them and not just, I guess, budgeting on a project or a feature in which you have no information at all.
Yeah, the problem with that approach, though, is that engineers got to choose whatever they worked on. What I'm proposing is that the executive team says, hey, we need to develop these features. We need to increase the confidence level on all of them, or in 5 of them. Let's put together 5 teams so that each one can work on one. And so if a year goes by and they still can't predict it with 80% confidence level, keep working on that. And so that's essentially R&D mode or prototyping mode. Not much process. The process should be run different than engineer, because engineer has different requirements. It's like they have to be secure. They have to do all QA stuff, things that may not matter when you're trying to find the solution to a problem. Once you find the solution, then you turn it into this scalable thing. And so this is where companies fail to separate the things that we're trying to figure out versus the engineering things that need to make it to production and put in the hands of customers. And we tried the Google approach. Please don't try it. It just doesn't work. It's what happens is that you have these random teams working on random stuff that don't have any buy-in from the executive team. So like you would need to do your organization. If you're trying to do it that way, there is...
So need as much money as Google has first.
Yeah. And then you have to restructure your organization. One structure that I learned at school is called nimble leadership, where it's like you structure your company to support these type of entrepreneurial projects, but you need also like different DNA of people. And on those teams, you need the entrepreneur that is going to be proactive about reaching out and stuff like that. And the great engineer, the great product and stuff like that. And so it's not just random. And I feel that the Google stuff, it was more random. I never worked at Google, so I don't know, but this is what I've experienced when we try to emulate that at Sendgrid.
Makes a lot of sense. If I force you to retire tomorrow as a founder and turn into a software early stage investor, what would be the things that you'll be looking for in other software companies that would get you excited about their potential success?
As far as ideas or as far as execution of those ideas?
Any criteria? Yeah.
If I was working on Memo, I would work on...
I'm more than specific ideas. I'm talking about the type of opportunities, problems, ideas, and I guess the founding team or products that you would be looking.
Yeah, so for products, and the reason why I say what I would be doing that I'm not going to do because I'm going to do Memo probably for a long time. But if I wasn't doing Memo and I'm going to become an investor, I would be very interested in health-related things with regards to food and supplements and exercise. I think that problem, it's already, not solved, but like we've been doing a lot of things to it. Like, for example, everyone knows that if you eat broccoli and chicken for a long time, you're just going to be like in good shape and work out. Like no matter what workout, you're going to be in good shape. Yet we don't do that. Right. And so why is that? And so if we can find the solution to that, where it's like, hey, maybe that we should approach it from the taste side of things so that people are healthier. Now imagine if we could get the world population healthier and a big chunk would be related to food, then I would be very interested in that. No matter what technology comes out, AI or whatever, like that's always a problem that we're going to have. What are we going to eat? And how are we going to be healthier? And so I think I would be very interested. I think that'll be a very long-lasting business.
Grab the opportunity to bring AI into the conversation and tying this back to what we're talking around how to allocate resources, how to organize developers around projects. Do you think that AI as a technology is actually more powerful for existing companies that have pre-built products and teams and resources and data? Or is it more powerful for new startups that are trying to, let's say, for example, someone wants to build from scratch a Sendgrid competitor and they have all this great new technology at their disposal?
Yeah, I think it's both. If I want to develop a Sendgrid competitor, AI would make it easier. And so now the earlier conversation about price disruption would be a good model to go with that, right? So I think there was one person, I don't remember who it was, that it's essentially having a startup studio that it's just using AI and trying to disrupt any SaaS business.
Charging much less, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a good strategy, right? I think what I love about AI is that the interface to use AI is very simple. And with that, allows existing companies to adopt it very quickly. And so I think the ones that have the data or the companies that need the data to develop a solution to a big problem, they're easily going to win because they already have the data and they already have the adoption. And so I think there's opportunities for both. And so this is because the adoption is so easy. Think of it like an iPhone or the cloud, where we had these technologies where it just made everything easier. Now, I think the problem, it's more like whether they believe on it. And I just did a chain on Memo on asking about how productive developers are using AI. A big chunk of our workforce at Memo is our developers. And I did a project myself, a small programming project. And oh my gosh, AI made me so much more productive. And so at that point, I just got scared for our workforce. It's, hey, this may be a tool that you may actually need. It may not be optional. Kind of like Git now is a tool that it's always required for every developer. And so you can use GitHub or GitLab and stuff like that. But it's more like if you don't know Git, it's like, whoa, like you probably can't work here or you got to learn it to work here type of stuff. I'm afraid that AI is going to be like that for developers. And so we're stopping 3 weeks from now. And we're going to do a net new project using AI because there's still the thought based on that chain that I created that it's easier right now to do it with net new projects than with existing projects. And so we'll see. But I think AI is going to be that tool that is just going to automate 80% of kind of what developers did. And the 20%, it's about solving problems, which I mean, I'm excited about.
Something that you mentioned a few minutes before was how hard and complex allocating developer resources becomes, especially as you grow. And you mentioned you have multiple levels of bureaucracy. And you want to build a new feature, and the products estimate a specific number of hours, and then the manager adds a buffer, and then the VP adds a buffer, and then the CEO adds a buffer, and then you take 10x more time than you expected you would take. Something that I'm curious about to get your take is how AI changes the bar for what an efficient tech team looks like, and then how that trickles down to the companies need less money now, the startups need less money now. If you meet a technical team and they're raising 10 million on a PowerPoint, you're thinking actually, hey, you're actually not going to spend that money that well, because with AI, you can actually be as efficient or as productive, but with a tenth of the money.
Some people say it may be even less productive because I have to context switch between writing code and actually asking. And context switching is very expensive. There are some people that say, yeah, it's very productive with these type of problems, and it's extremely productive with new problems. And so I think especially net new startups, my guess is that the expectation would be that, especially if it's a software company, that the resources would be even less. Now, the problem that I mentioned still applies though, because we still got to estimate how long things are going to take. And the thing though is that many times we don't know what we don't know. And those are the unknowns that essentially take most of the time. But if you already knew those unknowns, then predicting those type of things would be better. For example, I think a lot of crazy things are going to happen when you copy someone else's thing, because it's going to be so easy to copy things because now they already have the solution. And so you could, at that point, tell AI, oh, just write me something like this. And so they already have the solution to the problems. Now, are we going to introduce more software patents because of that? I don't know. So there are different things that could change, including even legal side of things. But at this point right now, I'm just thinking about the technical stuff. We're not there yet. The problem is that if you ask the AI to give you some piece of code to solve a problem, and if you ask exactly the same thing, it may give you different code. And so it's still not there yet, but it's getting there so fast.
Is there anything that you think people are estimating about AI capacity to build competitors? So for instance, let's say you want to build a Sendgrid competitor today, right now, and you're able to copy the code. But still, hey, Sendgrid has a community of developers, you have enterprise clients, and there's a lot of wraparounds that that are required to be able to effectively serve these customers beyond the actual code.
There is some element to that, but what you can do is have a clone, go to market, raise money, and try to find the optimizations that they found, and then just start copying those. And so now what's crazy is that it's the delta on value. So for example, if you find a company that it's worth $20 billion, and if you only need $5 million to compete on that $20 billion market, let's say you get to $100 million market cap, it's still okay, especially if you do it in months. I think the price of software, because of that, is going to go down because of the competition. I think there's going to be many competitors. Now, go-to-market strategies become very interesting. And then does the expectation of the customer change, knowing that software can be created so cheaply that they're not willing to pay the outrageous prices that some software companies charge? So there's a lot of things, a lot of dynamics, right? It's like customer behavior, competition, and now this is exciting. But I think instead of people getting scared for this, the way I see it is, oh my gosh, so much opportunity. The cloud introduced, the iPhone introduced, we're just shifting. And to shift, it requires work. And when there is work, then there's opportunity. And so I'm excited about the things that are going to happen. And we're seeing this where it's like most companies coming out, it's like AI for this, AI for that. So
Yep. In this, you spoke about this platform shift, right? And you referenced the iPhone or cloud. In this new world, what skills do you think become more important, and what skills you think become less valuable for
So
both developers, business people?
based on just the AI limited experience that I have, interacting with it requires writing correctly and clearly. And so communication, I think it becomes a very interesting thing. It's like, how do I communicate better? And this translates into writing prompts, or at some point it's just voice prompts or whatever. Whereas before, a developer was not well at communicating, but was a great developer, he or she could be very successful. And now I don't know if that's going to be the case. And so I think unless something changes, which I think would, because if I was a developer that was terrible at communicating, I would try to find the solutions to not make me terrible and not give me a disadvantage. And there are times where like these advantages and disadvantages would appear, but immediately it's more, if you're a good writer, then you could interact with AI pretty easily.
Speaking of being terrible at communication, I would love to go to our last segment of the interview. When we met, you told me something that I thought was pretty interesting, which is, and in reference to a podcast, you told me I would never be able to do what you do because I don't have your same personality. And you've always described yourself as an introverted engineer. So it seems like in your new company, in Memo, you're building a solution to your own problem. So I guess, what does building a social media platform for introvert means or entails?
Yeah. Now, I think it's funny that you use the word social media platform. And right now, social network platforms, we use them interchangeably, right? So if I say social network platform and social media platform, probably people would think that they're the same. And so we're actually focusing more on the network side of things. And this is why 90% of the content created on Twitter is created by less than 10% of the users. And by the way, I'm in the 90%. And so that means that people don't hear me. And so I believe that because people don't hear me and other 90%, that the world is very well physically connected. Internet adoption in the US, it's like closer to 90% or probably even more. And so we're very well physically connected in certain parts. I think the world is like 60% internet adoption. And so, but the problem that while we're very well physically connected, I can reach someone in another country immediately, less than a second. Logically, we're not. And the people that we're hearing about, it's only 10% of the population. And that's a problem that we want to fix. And so one of the ways that you can be heard is through content. But the problem with creating content is that I try to create a video on Instagram and I feel very uncomfortable. We found that there are 4 problems. People don't have the knowledge, don't have the resources, don't have the time. And a big thing is they don't have the personality. And so what we did is we created tools to help with that. We noticed that people would be great at going to a conference and a panel, but they wouldn't actually do an individual video on Instagram. And so we're creating tools that help people collaborate in content. If it was an asynchronous podcast, so you can have time to think, re-record things. What comes out of that, like we call these chains, is essentially a piece of content that has different opinions, is asynchronous, and it's probably more well-rounded than an individual opinion. And so sometimes you don't have to be proactive about creating them. You may just be called because you're just good at certain topics. Now, by doing this thing, people can develop a reputation so that when people are looking for them, they would get these requests faster than someone with a lower reputation. And so that's what we're trying to help people be heard and found without necessarily creating what existing social media platforms reward. And the keyword is media, right? Because they reward engagement and entertainment. And we're not
that's
about
their business model.
Yeah, that's a business model. Like the more you're in the platform, the more ads they can sell. In our case, we just wanted to create substance. And and the substance, the memos that you create are essentially something that helps you be found in that context where your memo is. And so that's what we're trying to essentially go after.
In a sense, through this chains, what you're trying to do is reduce the stakes of putting yourself out there for these 90% of folks that might not have, as you were saying, the natural or gravitate naturally towards publishing content or posting content. So I guess what are your hypotheses of how can you get like that 90% to get more involved to, or let's say, how can we increase that 10% of people that publish on Twitter to be 20 or 30 or 40, in this case for Memo, obviously?
We asked people if they had a personal brand, and most of them told us no. And then we asked them why not, and if they needed one. And what we got from the research was that most people understand the value of a personal brand, but they don't work on it because of the 4 problems that I just mentioned. And so people understand that value, that there is some type of economic value. It could be financial or influential, whatever that value is. It could be directly associated with a personal brand. And so we see that with people like The Rock and the Kardashians, that they have a great brand and they can sell products and stuff like that. And so this is where we see the influence translated into financial value. And so we understand that because we see it on a daily basis. But most of us are not willing to do that for, could be the personality or the time. So we asked initially people if they wanted to be found. Most of them told us no. No, I want my privacy. I don't want to be found. But we found like after 3 months that we were asking the wrong question. And is that most people actually want to be found, but in their own context. So for example, professionally, if you're a salesperson, and if you're selling a product that, I don't know, cases for a phone, you want to be found when someone's looking for a case on the phone. You may not want to be found by your friends or whatever, but in that context, you do want to be found. And so this is what we're trying to empower people to do, that if you're selling anything, you could be found around that context, or not just in the professional context, but even in the personal context. If you want to be found as a coach for Little League because you just won the championship with your previous team and now you have opportunity to do another team, you may want to be found as that. And also the opposite is true. Finding those type of people is extremely difficult. For example, if you wanted to connect with a plumber in Irvine that spoke Spanish, that could understand the picture of a shower that you need fixed, it's tough. You would have to maybe go to Yelp, contact a few people. Yep. But what if now the criteria was even more, where it's like, hey, I want to contact someone that speaks Spanish, that understands this picture, but also teaches a little, that coaches in Little League because I want to support that. So it's like these type of criteria, things are very difficult to execute on and to be found as, to the point where you may just need to run an ad on Facebook. And obviously running ads on Facebook can get very expensive.
You mentioned that you're building a social network, not a social media platform. So that's a very interesting distinction. I'm curious, as you've studied the market landscape of social media network platforms, what are some lessons that you've drawn inspiration from other social media companies to build Memo? And what are other things that you want to actually be totally orthogonal to and not even think about them or try to avoid them?
Yeah, there are many things that people like about social media platforms, and that is sometimes it makes it easy to create content, connect with people, have random connections. And so we got inspired by that. For example, how do you create content? How do you chat with people? What are your interactions? But the way we started is, could we develop something to solve that problem, to have what we call criteria-based messaging, giving a criteria, find someone and have the person be found. With that, we need a reputation. And so we thought, how do you create memos that would help you build this reputation so that you can be found above others that have lower reputation? So the message interaction, the content creation, we got inspired by these social media platforms because they do that pretty well. One thing that we wanted to start with is say, how do we develop what we do without taking the ad business model that these networks have? Because we don't want to invade people's privacy. In fact, we want to be the opposite. We want to have people be found just the way they want to be found, not us trying to invade their privacy and say, hey, I think you like TVs. You should get ads or messages around TVs. It's more like, why don't you just tell me that you want to get messages around TVs because it's Cyber Monday, and after that, you don't want to receive anything. And so right now, there's no control on these social media platforms because they care about engagement, and they care about engagement because they want to give you a bunch of ads. And so what we didn't adopt is that ad business model. We do want to logically connect people based on how they want to connect, not connect companies that are giving us ads and trying to guess who should receive this ad for maximum profit.
Then how do you monetize that? What have you thought about the business model for Memo?
A little bit. I think right now we're trying to solve the problem of connecting people, but there are multiple business models that we can explore. For example, we can create supply and demand curves of these senders and receivers. So for example, there are many plumbers in Irvine. A natural disaster hits Irvine. We would charge the senders to actually send messages to the plumber, or vice versa. If there isn't enough demand and there's many plumbers in Irvine and there's only one person a month, then we would charge the plumbers to receive these messages. That's one business model that we can explore. We would have to interview people if that's something that they would be interested on. Now, usually on a supply and demand curve, you have quantity. And so that's what we talked about. And then price, right? And so price would be, you would have to control supply and demand through price. And so that's one approach that we could take. Ultimately, that business model doesn't work out if we don't have people to want to be found or to find others. And right now we're starting with Latine entrepreneurs and VCs. We think they want to find each other. And so we have a community of Latino entrepreneurs and investors that they're essentially the first users. We have about 50 of them. And so if anyone watching or listening to this show wants to join that, just feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.
Well, we will leave the URL, the website, in the show notes. Isaac, one last closing question. What's something that's currently emerging that it excites you? It can be anything: an entrepreneur, a leader, a technology, a social movement, etc.
For me, it's this longevity interest where I'm going to turn 45 and I'm probably in better shape than in my 30s or my 20s.
You look super young, yeah.
and that is because I use the things that are available to me: supplements, food, data, machines to scan, and all these things. So I'm excited about that. And I talked about food earlier, but I think that's just very interesting. And we do see some hints of opportunity for this longevity thing. And so imagine right now we're like, okay, I don't know what the average age is, but I'm preparing to not be productive after 75, 80. Now imagine if we could be productive until 120. It's like, that would be very interesting on how the world looks. Now, that could also create some problems too.
It actually is already in some parts of the world.
And so I'm excited about that. But obviously with some innovation, it can create other issues. I haven't taken the time to look at everything as a whole system and what would cause, but that's what excites me.
Isaac, this was amazing. Thank you so much for the time. Glad we finally had the chance to record this.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.